It's good to see you. I apologize ahead of time. My throat is still a little bit froggy, but it's good to be with you this morning. Has anyone ever called you an ugly name? My guess is at some point in time, someone wasn't too kind to you, called you something that hurt. I was trying to think of an illustration, and I came up with one that I think really kind of captures kind of the point I'm trying to make here. And that is, when I was in school, one of the worst things someone could call you was a nerd. I mean, I was like, whoa. And of course, our world is now owned and operated by the nerds. See how easy that turns. And I know some people in here that would gladly wear the label nerd. And that's cool. See how it changed in just a few hundred years, my lifetime. But no, it changed very rapidly. But it really is kind of odd when you think about men like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Elon Musk. Probably at some point in time, some guy thought they were being really smart and called them a nerd. Yeah, okay. But that word, when it was originally said, was meant to hurt. It was meant to insult. It was meant to demean. Words are like that. They are both just sounds going through the air as we vocalize. But they're also hit deeper than almost any punch, kick, or slap. It's a strange paradox. But there's lots of places where we have words that either have been expunged from our usage or that have morphed into something else. The power of words can be seen in things like in 2013, the California State Legislature outlawed a word in all of their documentation and in all of their guidelines and manuals. And the word was retarded or retardation. They considered it too hurtful and changed it to intellectual disability. And I kind of can understand why they would do that. Because I know that word, while it existed in a clinical sense in the educational literature and things like that, in reality had been morphed into something else, had been changed from the very clinical idea into an insult. There's lots of words like that. What I wanted to do is talk to you this morning about a word that you wear right now that changed over time. If you were to follow me just briefly here in 1 Peter chapter 4, a passage you probably are very familiar with, but I'm going to begin reading in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler, But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he's not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. We wear the name Christian with pretty comfortable clothes, you know? That's not something that is demeaning, insulting in this world, but that's not the origins of the word. The origins of the word, I think, are reflected in this statement. As he says that you can be called a lot of things. You can be called a thief. You can be called a murderer. Be called a rebel, a troublemaker, a revolutionary, a terrorist. That's kind of that meaning of that word. Troublemaker. And somewhere in that list, in the colloquial use of the words at the time that this is written, you could have just inserted this other word and it would have been just as hurtful. You are a murderer, an evildoer, a terrorist. You are a Christian. And that was the way the word was used. We track the beginning of the insult back to Acts chapter 11. They were first called Christians in Antioch. In Acts 26, when Paul is talking to King Agrippa, there is this line at the end of the encounter as he says, "Would you in such a short time convince me or compel me to be a Christian?" And the way that is placed in many readings because of the punctuation, you would almost convince me to be a Christian. That's the way many people read that. That was not the way it was intended. Because King Agrippa was not a nice guy. His sister, Bernice, who is there when Paul is defending himself, was the mistress of the Roman general that would later obliterate the population of the city of Jerusalem. In fact, King Agrippa, who had a legion at his disposal, loaned his legion for Titus to complete that work. These were not nice people. And he says, and it may be a question, you would convince me in such a short time to be a Christian? The insult seems to be dripping in the statement. You're a believer, a follower, a disciple of a criminal. A man that was abused and hated. One who was insulted himself. Read Psalm 22. The insults that the leadership of the people and the people hurled at Jesus as he was hung on the cross. The death of a rebellious slave or the worst of the criminals. And you are one of them? And can you feel the hurt that was intended in that statement by someone in the day that Peter would have written this? That they were accusing them of being fools, dupes, insane, to follow someone who had been crucified in a little far-off, provincial corner of the empire, and you have dedicated your life to him. That was the way that word was originally intended. Now, with that background, I want you to listen again to Peter's words. He speaks here in verse 12 of a fiery ordeal. Let me tell you, that would not be a figure of speech to some of those that would read and hear the words of Peter. They would be burned alive by emperors such as Nero. In fact, that's a lot of the content of 1 Peter is about bad things are coming. And you need to be ready. In verse 12, again, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share in the suffering of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory, you may rejoice with exultation. Right there, he then says, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you're blessed. Because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. We've come here to celebrate and to think about the Lord's Supper. We need to hear the words, the insults, the hurtful things that were said, the humiliations that were heaped upon Jesus, because the pain of the cross was not only the physical, but also the emotional and spiritual. As he was rejected by not just man, but by God's own people, saying every hurtful thing they could think of as he was on the cross. And he says, if you share that, if you experience that as a believer, understand there is glory. Because what you are revealing is that you are not of this world. You are different. You are God's possession, he says earlier in this book. And he says, when the world recognizes that by throwing insults at you, now they see who you are. Now they comprehend that you are not of this world. Chosen race, royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. When they throw that ugly word at you, Christian, you share in the reaction that the people had to the Son of God. In the strange world of language and history, the venom in that word has largely, not completely, but largely disappeared. And we take that word as a matter of just a statement. Two things about that I'd like to leave you with. First, it may not always be that way. The tide may turn again, where that word becomes a threat, an insult, a chance to try to humiliate you. I can't predict the future, but it's possible that people will look and say, oh, you're one of those believers. You're one of those Christians. And it may mean the same thing that they did when they were casting insults at Jesus and when Peter writes these words. But we struggle sometimes as we participate in the Lord's Supper to come close to that moment, to draw near to the cross. I want you to think for a moment of the ugly, hurtful, humiliating things that they said to him, the perfect Son of God. And we draw near to that. He says, if this is who they identify you with, how glorious that you share in the suffering, even the non-physical suffering of Jesus. Now, this statement, of course, ends, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. We hold on to that blood-soaked cross, hearing the ugly words and the things that are said. My King, and I will gladly wear his name. That is who we are.